The summer air hung heavy in the neighborhood, carrying with it the faint smell of freshly cut grass, barbecue smoke, and something else far less pleasant: tension. The kind of tension that starts small, festering quietly behind closed doors, before one day exploding into a full-scale war. And in this case, the battleground was a simple wooden fence. It wasn't just any fence, it was mine. A tall, sturdy cedar wood barrier I had saved for months to build, carefully measuring each post, leveling each panel, and staining it with my own hands until the golden brown finish gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't only about property lines, it was about privacy, peace, and finally being able to enjoy my backyard, without feeling like every step I took was being monitored by the hawk eyes of my neighbor, Karen. Karen had lived next door long before I moved in. People warned me about her. They said she was the self-appointed queen of the block, the kind of person who treated the HOA like her personal throne. She wasn't on the board, but she might as well have been. Rules bent when she wanted them to, exceptions were made for her, and somehow every minor inconvenience turned into a crusade against whichever neighbor she had set her sights on. And, unfortunately, I had landed in her crosshairs the day construction on my fence began. From the very first post hammered into the ground, I could feel her eyes drilling into me from her porch. She'd stand there with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, watching as though I were committing some heinous crime. When the fence started to take shape, she began pacing along the property line, muttering under her breath. By the time it was finished, she was already planning her first attack. At first, she disguised her complaints as concerns. She slipped notes into my mailbox, each one more dramatic than the last. The fence was too tall, the stain color was unnatural, the wood wasn't neighborhood approved. She insisted it blocked her view of the street, as though the entire neighborhood had been built solely for her enjoyment. When the HOA didn't back her up, she escalated. The first real sign of trouble came one morning when I woke to find one of the panels pried loose, nails bent as though someone had tried to yank it off with brute force. My stomach twisted with anger, but I didn't need to guess who was behind it. There was only one person petty enough to sabotage my fence under the cover of night. I replaced the panel and reinforced the posts with steel brackets, making sure it would take far more effort to break them again. But Karen wasn't deterred. The next day, I caught her in the act. She was standing on her side of the yard, hands gripping the top of the fence, tugging and shaking it with wild determination. The wood creaked under her weight, but it held. I stood frozen for a moment, watching as she fought against it like a caged animal trying to claw its way out. That was when I realized this wasn't about the fence at all. To her, it was about control. She couldn't stand the idea that I had created something she couldn't influence, something that separated her from the power she thought she wielded over the neighborhood. My fence wasn't just wood and nails, it was a boundary, a line she couldn't cross, and that was unbearable to her. From then on, it was war. She called the HOA repeatedly, demanding they order me to tear it down. She staged dramatic scenes on her lawn whenever she saw me outside, pretending to cry or rant into her phone about property violations. She even tried to rally the other neighbors, claiming my fence would lower property values and destroy the aesthetic harmony of the community. But her theatrics didn't sway anyone. Most people were tired of her antics already, and many quietly admired that I had finally given her something she couldn't control. That only made her angrier. One night I woke to the sound of pounding, wood splitting, nails screeching as they were wrenched from their place. I rushed outside with a flashlight, heart hammering, and there she was again. Karen. In her pajamas, barefoot on the damp grass, gripping a crowbar and slamming it into the base of the fence like a woman possessed. The sight was almost surreal. When the beam of my flashlight caught her, she froze. For a split second, we locked eyes, and I could see the fury burning in hers. But beneath that rage was something else. Desperation. She wasn't just trying to tear down my fence. She was trying to reclaim the dominance she thought she had over the neighborhood. I didn't yell. I didn't confront her in that moment. I simply pulled out my phone and recorded. The camera caught everything. The crowbar in her hand, the damage she'd already caused, the look on her face when she realized she had been caught. She dropped the tool and scurried back into her house, slamming the door behind her. But the damage was done, not to my fence, but to her reputation. I knew right then that this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to back down, not even when caught red-handed. She would double down, escalate, and claw at every possible angle until she either won or destroyed herself trying. What she didn't know, however, was that I was already a step ahead. The footage I had captured wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon. And soon, I would turn it into the very thing that would trap her inside the walls she had been so desperate to tear down. Because if Karen hated fences so much, I was about to give her one she could never escape. And that's when the real game began. The following morning, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet whispers. News traveled fast around here, faster than any official notice from the HOA, faster than the gossip columns in the local paper. And when one of those whispers involved Karen, it spread like wildfire. She emerged from her house just after sunrise, her usual routine of pacing her front yard disrupted by nervous glances toward my property. I could tell she knew the video I had captured was a ticking time bomb. She didn't know what I would do with it yet, and that uncertainty ate away at her composure. Her movements were sharp, twitchy, like a predator that suddenly realized it had become the prey. I didn't release the footage immediately. Instead, I let it linger, a storm cloud hanging overhead. I made sure Karen saw me outside more often than usual, phone in hand, casually glancing her way. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about control. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted, and she didn't like it. By noon, the HOA president was at my door. A polite knock, a nervous smile, and then the familiar shuffle of someone who had clearly been pressured into a task they didn't want. He carried a clipboard and a stack of papers, but the way he sighed before speaking told me everything I needed to know. Karen had already struck. Her complaint this time wasn't about the height of the fence or the color of the stain. No, this time she was claiming that I had physically intimidated her. According to her, I had threatened her while she was inspecting the fence line and made her feel unsafe in her own yard. The accusations were absurd, but it was a classic Karen tactic. Flip the script, play the victim, and force others to take her side. I listened patiently as the HOA president read from his notes, avoiding eye contact the entire time. Then, without a word, I pulled out my phone, opened the video, and pressed play. The sound of wood splintering filled the air, followed by the unmistakable image of Karen herself, wielding the crowbar, attacking my fence like a vandal in the night. The president's face drained of color. He stammered something about needing to review this with the board, and left in a hurry, clutching the clipboard like a shield. I knew what would happen next. The board would meet, Karen would be confronted, and for once, she wouldn't have the upper hand. But Karen didn't retreat quietly. That wasn't her way. Within hours, she was back in her yard, phone pressed to her ear, pacing furiously as she launched call after call. She spoke loudly, deliberately, so anyone nearby could hear her side of the story. She claimed the video was doctored, that I had set her up, that this was all part of some grand conspiracy against her. Theatrics, always theatrics. That evening, she escalated again. When I returned from work, I found her car parked half on my lawn, wheels digging into the grass. She had left it there deliberately, doors locked, as though daring me to make a move. It was petty, childish, but also telling. The walls were closing in on her, and she was lashing out in every way she could. I called the police, not to cause a scene, but to create a record. The officer who arrived took one look at the car, shook his head, and filed a report. Karen came storming out of her house, shrieking about harassment and abuse of power, but it didn't matter. For the first time, her words carried no weight. The evidence was too strong, her behavior too erratic. That night, I sat in my living room reviewing the footage again. Not just of her with the crowbar, but the clips I had quietly collected over the weeks. Her pacing the fence line, her tugging at the posts, her loud rants in the yard. Piece by piece, I was building a story, one that showed the truth of who she was and how far she was willing to go. And as I watched, an idea began to form. Karen hated fences. She hated being boxed in, restricted, denied control. She had tried again and again to tear mine down, desperate to reassert her dominance. But what if I turned that desperation against her? What if, instead of tearing down my fence, she found herself trapped by one of her own making? The thought lingered, growing sharper with each passing minute. It wasn't just about defending my property anymore. It was about teaching her a lesson she couldn't ignore. For too long, she had terrorized this neighborhood, using intimidation and manipulation to get her way. Now, she was about to experience what it felt like to live on the other side of her own tactics. The next morning, I got to work. I ordered materials, panels, posts, cement, everything I would need. I hired a crew, framing it as an expansion project for my property. And when the trucks arrived, Karen was right there on her porch, fuming, demanding to know what was happening. She shouted questions I didn't answer, called the HOA, even flagged down one of the workers to interrogate him. But none of it mattered. The crew had their instructions, the permits were in order, and the plan was already in motion. Karen thought she had been fighting against one fence. She had no idea I was about to build another, one that would make her yard feel smaller than she ever imagined, and this time she wouldn't be able to tear it down. The first post sank into the earth with a dull thud, cement filling the hole around it like the closing of a lock. The sound was ordinary, almost insignificant, but to Karen it might as well have been the toll of a warning bell. Each strike of the hammer, each scrape of a shovel echoed across the neighborhood, and with every noise, her agitation grew. She was on her porch again, arms flailing, phone pressed to her ear. She called the HOA, the city, anyone who might listen. She paced the property line like a guard on patrol, demanding explanations from the workers, insisting that this was illegal and unauthorized, but the permits were in place, stamped and sealed, and every inch of the project had been planned within the letter of the law. The truth was simple, she couldn't stop it. From her perspective, the crew appeared to be adding to my fence, expanding it in strange directions, tightening its shape. What she didn't realize was that the design was intentional. Angled panels, overlapping sections, and careful placement of posts that subtly curved inward. Piece by piece, her side of the property was being boxed in. It wasn't immediate. The first day looked harmless, just a few posts along the border, a small extension that could have meant anything. But by the second day, the outline was clear. The panels rose higher than before, angled strategically so that Karen's yard seemed to shrink. Her once wide-open view of the street was cut off. The breeze she used to brag about catching through her porch was blocked. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer as the walls grew taller. Neighbors began to notice. Some stood at a distance, whispering, while others walked slowly past, pretending not to stare. They had lived under Karen's tyranny for years, enduring her constant complaints and power plays. Now they watched with a mix of fascination and relief as the tables turned. Karen, of course, refused to accept it. She stormed over to the HOA office, demanding emergency meetings. She tried to file restraining orders, insisting that my fence was a weapon being used against her. She even claimed it was a psychological attack, some kind of harassment designed to drive her out of her own home. And in a way, she was right. By the third day, her panic had fully taken hold. I saw it in the way she lingered at her windows, peering through blinds that no longer offered a view. She started leaving her house less and less, retreating to her backyard like it was the last safe space she had. But that space too was closing in. Every morning the crew returned. Every evening more panels stood tall where open air had once been. The fence no longer marked just the border between properties. It had become a looming wall, a barrier that cut her yard off from the world. The psychological shift was subtle but undeniable. Karen had always thrived on visibility. She wanted to be seen, to be heard, to insert herself into every neighbor's life whether they liked it or not. But now, the very thing she craved, an audience, was gone. She was hidden, walled off, a queen with no subjects to command. Her response was predictable. She tried sabotage again, sneaking out at night with tools in hand. But the new construction wasn't like my original fence. The posts were buried deeper, the panels reinforced with steel brackets, the wood sealed to withstand weather and force alike. Where once she had been able to pry and bend, now her efforts ended in nothing but exhaustion and frustration. I knew because I was watching. Quiet cameras, discreetly placed, caught every attempt. Each clip added to the growing collection of evidence, a story that painted Karen not as a victim, but as an aggressor unraveling under the weight of her own obsession. By the end of the week, her yard was fully enclosed. The design wasn't absolute. There were still gaps, spaces where she could technically leave, but the illusion was powerful. Tall walls rose on every side, angled inward just enough to create a sense of confinement. When she stood in the middle of her lawn, it no longer felt like freedom. It felt like a cage, and that was the point. Neighbors began to notice the change in her demeanor. Where once she had strutted through the streets, loudly criticizing lawns, fences, and flower beds, now she lingered in the shadows of her own walls. Her voice, once booming across property lines, had softened to mutters. Her steps, once heavy and commanding, were reduced to restless pacing inside her shrunken domain. The irony was delicious. Karen, who had spent years inserting herself into everyone else's business, was now trapped within the very boundaries she had fought so hard to erase. And the best part? She had no one to blame but herself. But I wasn't finished. The physical walls were only half the plan. The real trap was psychological, and it was working beautifully. She was restless, paranoid, desperate to reclaim the control she had lost. Every move she made played directly into the narrative I was crafting. A narrative that would soon make her the villain in the eyes of the entire community. And once that happened, there would be no way out. Because while fences can be torn down, reputations cannot. And Karen S. was about to collapse under the weight of the walls she had built around herself. The transformation of the neighborhood was almost immediate. Where once Karen's voice had carried across every yard, now silence pressed against her walls. Neighbors who used to flinch at her sudden appearances on their lawns no longer had to look over their shoulders. Children rode their bikes past her house without fear of being scolded for scratching the pavement. Couples walked their dogs without worrying about being accused of leaving invisible messes on her property. For the first time in years, the community exhaled, and Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the block, found herself alone in her shrinking kingdom. At first, she fought to maintain her presence. She stood on her porch and shouted through the gaps in the fence, trying to bark orders at passers-by. She left notes taped to the panels, filled with threats of lawsuits and HOA complaints. But no one responded. The notes curled under the sun, ignored, until the wind carried them away. Isolation began to set in. She tried to fight it with noise, blasting music from outdoor speakers, slamming doors, even running her lawnmower at odd hours in a desperate attempt to remind the neighborhood that she was still there. But the walls absorbed much of the sound, muting her tantrums. The world outside her fence carried on without her, and she couldn't stand it. Inside her yard, the signs of strain grew clearer each day. The once manicured lawn, which she had obsessively maintained as a badge of superiority, began to wither. Weeds sprouted along the edges where she no longer patrolled as diligently. Her flower beds, once a source of constant bragging, sagged under neglect. I watched from my side, cameras recording every shift in her behavior. She paced for hours, staring at the panels, running her hands over the wood as if searching for weak spots. At night, she sat in a lawn chair, eyes fixed on the fence like it was a living enemy. Neighbors began to whisper about her too. Not with fear this time, but with pity. They saw her decline, her frantic pacing, her muttered rants to herself. And slowly the power she had wielded over them dissolved into nothing. She was no longer the woman who controlled the HOA with threats and intimidation. She was just Karen, the neighbor who had lost her grip. Still, she tried to lash out. She wrote long, furious emails to the HOA, accusing them of conspiring against her. She called city inspectors, demanding emergency interventions. She even attempted to contact local news stations, spinning wild stories about being walled into her own property. But when investigators came, they found nothing illegal. The permits were airtight, the construction flawless. On paper, it was just a fence, tall perhaps and imposing, but still entirely within the law. And each failed attempt only deepened her paranoia. She began avoiding her front yard altogether, retreating to the back where the walls felt closer, the shadows heavier. She set up cameras of her own, pointing them at the fence as if waiting for some hidden attack. But the attack never came. Not in the way she expected. Because the truth was, I didn't need to lift another finger. The trap was already working. The walls weren't just physical barriers, they were psychological ones. Every day she spent inside them chipped away at her confidence. Every ignored note, every unanswered shout, every failed complaint left her more powerless. She wasn't trapped by nails and wood, she was trapped by her own reputation, her own actions, and the silence of a neighborhood that no longer cared to listen. And then came the breaking point. One afternoon, during a rare burst of energy, she attempted to scale the fence. Neighbors later described seeing her drag a ladder from her garage, setting it shakily against the panels, and climbing with frantic determination. But the ladder slipped, the base skidding on uneven grass. She fell hard, landing in a heap on her lawn. The sound of her cries carried briefly over the fence, but no one came. The neighbors had learned not to respond to her theatrics, assuming it was just another performance. By the time she limped back into her house, clutching her side, she was truly alone. Word of the incident spread quickly, and with it came the final unraveling of her authority. The neighborhood no longer feared her, they pitied her, mocked her, dismissed her as a relic of a fight she had already lost. And for Karen, that was worse than defeat. The walls had done their job. She was isolated, ignored, irrelevant. The queen of the neighborhood had been dethroned, not by force, but by silence. But for me, the game wasn't over. I had more footage than I could ever need. Hours of her rants, her sabotage attempts, her humiliating collapse. I had the power not just to isolate her, but to expose her. To turn her name into a cautionary tale. A story whispered not just on this block, but far beyond it. Karen had tried to tear down my fence. Now she couldn't even leave her yard. And soon the whole world would know it. It started small, like a spark in dry grass, a single video clip uploaded quietly, without fanfare. The footage showed Karen under the cover of night, crowbar in hand, attacking my fence like a thief dismantling someone else's property. There was no commentary, no need for explanation. The images spoke for themselves, raw, undeniable, and damning. Within hours, the views began to climb. Neighbors who had endured her wrath for years shared it among themselves, chuckling at the irony. They sent it to friends, who sent it to others. Soon it leapt beyond the neighborhood, across social feeds and forums dedicated to stories of HOA nightmares and entitled neighbors. By the end of the week, the clip had gone viral. The internet christened her with a new title: Fence Karen. Memes appeared overnight. Her face frozen mid-swing, captions mocking her desperate attempts to destroy what she couldn't control. Animated parodies spread, commentary channels dissected her behavior, and strangers across the country laughed at a woman they had never met but instantly recognized. For Karen, it was a nightmare. The walls of her yard had already become a prison. But now the entire world had joined in, peering through invisible bars. Her phone rang incessantly with numbers she didn't recognize. Strangers drove past her house to see the infamous Fence Karen for themselves. Some even slowed down to take pictures, pointing at the towering walls that had turned her yard into a cage. Her desperation deepened. She boarded up her windows to block the view of gawkers. She screamed at anyone who passed by, hurling accusations of harassment and invasion of privacy. But the harder she fought, the more she fed the spectacle. Every outburst was captured, recorded, and uploaded, fueling the fire she was trying to extinguish. The HOA, once her greatest weapon, finally washed their hands of her. Faced with undeniable evidence of her sabotage and the overwhelming public humiliation she brought on the community, they issued a formal statement distancing themselves from her entirely. For years, she had manipulated them with threats and pressure, but now they cut ties without hesitation. She was no longer their enforcer. She was their liability. And the neighbors? They reveled in her downfall. For so long, Karen had lorded over them, nitpicking every blade of grass, every paint color, every minor infraction. Now they had front-row seats to her collapse. They gathered on sidewalks, exchanging smiles and stories about the times she had tormented them. Children rode past her fence chanting, "Fence Karen," their laughter ringing out as she screamed through the gaps. Her once immaculate property fell further into disrepair. Without the constant validation of an audience, her motivation crumbled. The lawn grew patchy, the flower beds withered, and the air of superiority she once wore like armor evaporated. She looked smaller now, shrunken inside her own yard, trapped not by nails and wood, but by the eyes of the world. And yet, even then, she couldn't accept defeat. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she tried again to reclaim control. She wheeled her trash bins to the curb, not for pickup, but as makeshift barricades. She dragged old furniture into the yard, stacking it against the walls in some frantic attempt to scale her prison. Neighbors gathered quietly to watch, phones in hand, recording every frantic move. When she finally managed to scramble to the top of one panel, she froze, staring out at the small crowd assembled below. The sight must have been crushing. For years she had tried to command their respect through fear. Now they looked at her with mockery, amusement, and pity. She hesitated too long. The panel shifted beneath her weight, and she tumbled back into her yard with a crash. Gasps and laughter echoed across the street, followed by the glow of screens capturing every second. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Her cage had grown tighter. The physical walls held her in, but the real prison was now digital. No matter where she turned, she couldn't escape the name, the reputation, the laughter. She had wanted control, but instead, she had become a spectacle, a cautionary tale played out for millions. And I? I didn't need to say a word. The world had taken over, amplifying what I had started. The fence had become more than a boundary. It was a symbol, a reminder that when you spend your life trying to tear others down, eventually the walls close in on you instead. Karen had tried to tear down my fence. Now she couldn't leave her yard, and she couldn't leave her name behind either. But there was still one more turn left in the story. Because while the neighborhood had seen her fall, I was about to make sure her legacy remained sealed forever. The neighborhood had grown used to the rhythm of Karen's downfall. What once had been chaos spilling into every street corner was now routine. Her muffled shouting from behind the fence, her frantic pacing in the yard, the occasional crash of some failed escape attempt. Neighbors barely flinched anymore. Children played freely, adults tended their lawns without fear, and the air, once thick with tension, had turned light again. But inside her shrinking world, Karen was unraveling. The viral storm hadn't subsided. It had only grown worse. Every slip, every outburst, every failed stunt became fuel for the endless churn of the internet. The clips were stitched into compilations, the memes recycled into fresh jokes, the name Fence Karen etched deeper into online folklore. She was no longer just a local tyrant. She was a caricature, immortalized as the woman who had caged herself in her own yard. And she knew it. Her once sharp, calculating eyes now darted nervously whenever she ventured outside. Her voice, which used to carry with arrogance, cracked with exhaustion. She had spent years building her identity on control, but now she couldn't even control her own image. The world saw her for what she was, and no matter how she fought, she couldn't change it. Still, Karen wasn't finished. Late one night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, I saw her emerge again. She dragged tools into the yard, a saw, a hammer, a rusted sledge, and set to work on the panels. She attacked with desperation, striking the wood until her arms gave out, sawing through planks only to collapse in defeat when the reinforced steel brackets held strong. Each swing was weaker than the last, each strike less certain, until she finally slumped against the fence, panting, beaten not by me, but by her own futility. The cameras captured it all. And in that moment, I knew it was time to finish what had begun. The next morning I compiled everything. The footage of her sabotage, her rants, her failed escape attempts, her humiliating collapse against the very walls she had once tried to destroy. It wasn't just a collection of clips, it was a story. A story of arrogance turned to downfall, of control twisted into confinement. I released it as a full video. The title was simple, cutting, and final. Karen tried to tear down my fence, now she can't leave her yard. It spread faster than I could have imagined. News outlets picked it up, talk shows replayed it, commentary channels dissected it frame by frame. Karen's name wasn't just a meme anymore. It was a phenomenon, a cultural shorthand for entitlement meeting